Hello everybody, my name's Tom, back talking about F1 Fantasy, and in this video I'm going to be discussing 7 big mistakes that we all make as F1 Fantasy managers, and these mistakes will translate into other fantasy games, but I'm going to be thinking specifically about F1 Fantasy, and let's face it, we're all human, or at least I think we are, looking at you, but yeah, humans make mistakes, and these are my 7 kind of biggest mistakes that I think people will fall into, and I'm definitely guilty of doing this myself. And let's face it, no one's perfect, but we can always consider these mistakes and try and work on them and try and not fall into that sort of trap in order to improve as an F1 fantasy manager. So number 1 in the 7 deadly sins of F1 fantasy management is picking your favourite driver, having that bias towards someone that you just like, because picking the best team or what you think is the optimal team is not always easy, and sometimes it comes down to, I like Danny Ricciardo, I like Seb Vettel, put him in the team, we'll cheer him on, and it'll be make it more fun, and that's absolutely fine if you just want to be completely casual about the game and just if your favourite driver does well and he also scored you some points in F1 Fantasy, that's great, you feel good. But if you're here to just genuinely make points and get a good rank, like a boring people like myself just want to get a good rank, don't fall into that trap, basically. Try and be as objective as you can when you're picking your drivers and your constructor, and don't try and take your emotion kind of out of the game. I think taking your emotion out of the game is just a good rule of thumb anyway. Even when you do badly or do really well, you don't want to get too high or too low. So try and keep a balanced level head and not pick drivers based on the fact that you like them, because that's just not an optimal way to pick your team. So stop putting Danny Rick in your team this season. He's not doing well. So number 2 on the list of 7 deadly sins of F1 fantasy management is too much attention on FP1, FP2, FP3. You might be thinking, what are you talking about, Tom? It's really important looking at the practice sessions. And I do think it is important looking at the practice sessions, but I myself have definitely fallen into the trap of too much attention on FP1, FP2, FP3, and kind of almost forgetting, what's happened across the rest of the season, the general trends, which cars kind of suit which tracks, and you get a car or a driver that suddenly pops up and does really well in one of the practice sessions, and suddenly it's like, get him in the team, got to get him in the team, he looks so good, and you kind of forget that actually the rest of the season he's not done that well, or the car actually isn't suited that well, and you might be deceived by certain cars with high amounts of fuel in the car, so that makes them look slow, and then some cars that are making sort of lower fuel runs and they look really quick, and you suddenly jump on them thinking they're going to qualify really well and do really well in the race, and actually they're not. So as much as I do think practice sessions are very important, try not to get too carried away and make all your decisions based on what happens in the practice session. What I do going into the race weekend is certainly have an idea of the sort of team that you're looking at. Have 1 or 2 team structures in your mind before going into that weekend, and see if the practice sessions kind of confirm what you're thinking, or if the practice sessions are going to make you rethink what you've already assumed was going to happen that weekend. So use the practice sessions to kind of cement or change what you already predict was going to happen, but don't just use them solely as this guy looks good, he's in the team, because it doesn't always work like that. So number 3 on the list is being different for different sake. So you're bored of putting Ferrari as your constructor, you're bored of putting Red Bull as your constructor, let's just change it up. McLaren on a race streak or on a quali streak, maybe they're not even on a double streak. I'm going to put them in, just change it up, and that will enable me to get, Verstappen, Leclerc and Russell and Hamilton all in the same team. But don't do it. Don't change it for the sake of it just because you're a bit bored and you want to break away from the template. I've definitely been guilty of breaking away from what I think is the best sort of template team this season. And it's bitten me, basically. So pick the team you think is going to be the best, even if it's a bit boring. I liken this to FPL, where people are kind of fed up of picking like Salah or whoever because it's just a bit boring. But people pick the best assets for a reason, because they get the points. So don't say no to a nice handful of points just because you're kind of a bit fed up of picking the same people. Charles Leclerc is the best turbo driver this season, most of the way for the season anyway, for a reason. So keep picking him as long as you can, as long as he's under 20 million. And Red Bull and Ferrari are the best constructors. Mercedes on occasion, maybe if you're on a streak you want to pick them, but don't go different just for different sake, because it could pay off, but more than likely it's going to hurt you. And this entire game of fantasy is kind of about gambling on what's the most predictable thing that's going to happen, and taking a gamble on something that is kind of high variance and not very likely to pay off is not the way to get the points. So stick to kind of the boring, and you'll get those steady points and you'll get a good rank at the end of the season. So number 4 on the list is having the blinkers on, literally like blinkers on certain drivers or even constructors. And I just talked about constructors, and I do think Ferrari and Red Bull, particularly in this season 2022, are the best picks. But specifically for drivers, I think having the blinkers on certain people, and I'll give a couple of examples of exactly what I'm talking about. Alex Albon, Lance Stroll, George Russell. I think a lot of people have not been picking these people throughout the season because for various reasons. I think early on in the season, people weren't picking Albon and particularly Stroll because of the budget restraints and the fact that the Haas boys were doing really well and everyone was on Kevin Magnussen at the start of the season. But it's about recognising as early as possible when to jump on these people and you start to see these trends before they become an actual trend. And, picking Alex Albon after the first sort of 3 or 4 races would have got you some good points. Getting on Lance Stroll a bit earlier when your budget increases over the likes of the Williams or Haas drivers would have been really good. And if you've stuck with George Russell in your team, then you've probably been picking up nice steady points throughout the season. But I personally have kind of had the blinkers on George Russell most of the season because he's over 20 million. You can't turbo drive him. He's an awkward price point. I certainly have my reasons for not picking him, but I think if you have managed to get him in your team throughout the season and your team hasn't, suffered too much as a result of that, and I think you've probably done quite well this season. You may even be, very, very high rank. Who knows? But yeah, so it's about kind of being open-minded. Don't just completely focus in on what you think is the best team, because this is a dynamic season. Things change, cars develop, different cars suit different tracks, different drivers like different tracks, etc., etc. There's lots of variation going on. So don't get too narrow-minded and have your mind open to alternative drivers and keep an eye out for those trends that start to appear and jump on them before everyone else realizes they're getting you good points. And coming in at number 5 in the 7 deadly sins is the streaks. Now, obviously, the streaks are important and they're useful and they're nice little bonuses, but at the end of the day, that's kind of all they are. They're nice little bonuses. And I think people kind of bend their teams around and warp their teams to squeeze in people on quali streaks or race streaks. And whilst, if the big assets are on those streaks, I think it's probably worthwhile getting them in your team. For the lesser drivers, we saw the Hases on a race streak earlier. I think some people probably put Haas in their team because, they're on a race streak, that'll make up for all the other points that they will never get. At the end of the day, it's just 10 points. If your constructor, if you want your constructor to consistently score 50, 60 or more points, which you should be aiming for, 10 points into that 50, 60 or more points isn't a grand amount, to be honest. And I think warping your team around picking the race streaks is not ideal, and I admit I did do it to some extent for the Zandvoort race this year in 2022 because there were a lot of drivers on streaks and it just made sense to get them in your team because there were so many, and some of the big assets, for example, I think Carlos Sainz and I think maybe Perez, I can't remember exactly, were on streak, so it made sense to get them in your team. But don't warp your team to bring in some of the lesser assets just because they're on a race streak, or in particular the constructors. If you see McLaren or Alpine or some of the constructors that don't score those big points like the Red Bulls and the Ferraris, don't put them in your team just because they're on a streak. It's very unlikely. I mean, yes, of course, it could pay off and you'll be like, haha, Tom said don't pick Alpine, then they got 50 points, haha. But it's not going to work every time. It's not going to work most of the time. So don't warp your team based on streaks. Use them as little bonuses and nice little treats to have every now and again. But yeah, don't build your team around them. Just try and incorporate them if you can. But if you can't get them, it's not the end of the world. And coming in at number 6 in the F1 Fantasy 7 Deadly Sins is not paying attention to your own instincts, not listening to your own gut instincts and going for the team that you genuinely want to pick, paying too much attention to these big shot YouTubers. Looking at me? No, I'm definitely not a big shot, but paying too much attention maybe to people like me that just rattle on about their own opinion, and maybe that influences you to too much. I mean, yeah, sure, listen to what I'm saying if you like watching my videos, and I think it should help form your opinion, but make sure that at the end of the day you're picking your team because it's your team, and you don't want to be like, I listened to Tom, he said pick Fernando Alonso and he bloody crashed into the wall like an idiot and now it's all Tom's fault, blah blah blah. You want to own your decisions, and especially when they go well, then you can feel good about picking the team that you chose yourself. And I think you can get carried away with the crowd. You're following people on Twitter, you're watching people on YouTube, and you kind of get a bit narrow-minded. You think, these people must know what they're talking about, and I hope I kind of know what I'm talking about. But I'm one person and you are your own person, so make sure you're making your own decisions. Use as much information that's out there. Use Twitter, use YouTube, use whatever resources you want. But please, at the end of the day, make sure you're making your decision for your team, and you'll be a lot happier for it. And the seventh and most deadly of the deadly sins, or maybe not most deadly, but the one that people seem to ask me a lot of questions about in social media and everything, is the budget. If you don't pay attention to your budget, it will hurt towards the end of the season. And yes, it's not going to hurt massively, but it does make a difference having that extra, 5 million. At the current time of recording, I've got about 110 million budget. And if you're sat on like 103, 104, 105 million, whilst it's not the end of the world, me having an extra 5 million means I can pick, for example, an Alpine driver over a Williams driver. I mean, that's quite a big difference. They should be getting like at least double the points of a Williams driver every race. So, I'm potentially scoring an extra 10 plus points than you each week because I have the budget. So pay attention to the price changes and don't warp your teams and use up all your substitutions, every week just to get money. Particularly at this stage of the season, as of the time of recording, 6 races left in 2022. It's not really worth warping your teams and using up your substitutions because the season's going to end and then your budget means nothing. But whilst the races are still going on, the budget is important. So particularly at the beginning of the season, make sure you pay close attention to the budget. Don't warp your teams around it, but pay attention to it and be mindful of it, and just kind of naturally grow your budget. Don't go all in on it, because I still think the points are more important, particularly at the beginning of the season. You should be focusing on picking the points, and then, the budget should sort of grow itself to some extent. But yeah, don't ignore what's going on with the price changes, and build that budget, and then you can afford the better teams later on in the season, and you should be getting the bigger points towards the end of the season. So that's my 7th of the 7 deadly sins. Pay attention to the budget. So that was the 7 deadly sins of F1 fantasy management. Of course, there are many, many more sins that we all commit when we play in this game. But those are just 7 I picked out that maybe you're not really so conscious of, or maybe you just, don't really think about, whatever. But yeah, just hopefully this video has been helpful. If it has, then please give it a like and maybe subscribe. And I'll be back pretty soon for yet more videos because I enjoy doing these videos on F1 Fantasy. So if you like, subscribe, and I'll see you for the next one. Thanks very much for watching. Bye bye.